It started with the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. You know the kind, the cheap ones that flicker just enough to make you doubt your eyesight. I was working a late-night shift at McDonald's, the kind where the only customers are either drunk, exhausted, or something else entirely. It was 2:37 a.m., and the lobby was practically dead, except for one guy. He'd been sitting in the corner booth for hours, his tray untouched, sipping on a black coffee that must have gone cold ages ago. He wore a hooded jacket, the kind of oversized hoodie that swallowed his face in shadow. I didn't think much of him at first, we get all kinds here. But something about the way he sat, motionless, made my skin prickle. I was wiping down the counter when my coworker Lisa nudged me. "You see that guy?" she whispered, her voice low enough to not carry across the empty restaurant. "He's been staring at the same spot for like an hour." I glanced over. Sure enough, the guy's head was tilted ever so slightly, his gaze locked on the menu board above the counter. But his eyes, they didn't move. Not like he was reading, at least. It was like he was looking past it, or through it. "Maybe he's just zoning out," I said, trying to shrug it off. "Or high. You know how it is." Lisa didn't buy it. Zoning out doesn't last 3 hours. And high? Dude, even stoners blink. That's when the man moved. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift of his head, like he'd heard us. The hair on my arms stood up. But here's the weird thing, his hood didn't move with him. It stayed perfectly still, like it wasn't part of him at all. I shook it off, chalking it up to sleep deprivation or whatever, but Lisa wasn't having it. "Go talk to him," she said, nudging me again. "Ask if he needs anything." "Why me?" I whispered back. "Because you're the customer service guy," she said with a smirk. I sighed, adjusted my visor, and made my way over to his table. "Hey there," I said, trying to sound as upbeat as someone can at nearly 3 in the morning. "Can I get you anything else? Maybe warm up that coffee?" For a second, he didn't react. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward me. His face was pale, unnaturally pale, like paper or wax. And his eyes, they were dark. Not dark like brown or black, but dark like there was nothing behind them at all. Just empty sockets that seemed to pull you in the longer you looked. "Nah," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. "I'm good." That was it. Just 2 words. But the way he said it, it was like a chill passed through the whole building. I forced a smile, muttered something about letting me know if he needed anything, and hurried back to the counter. Lisa was waiting, her eyes wide. Well, he's creepy as hell," I said. "But he's not breaking any rules." Lisa leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You didn't see his hands?" I frowned. "What about them?" She motioned toward the guy, but when I looked back, his hands were hidden under the table. "They're all messed up," Lisa whispered. "Like claws or something." I laughed, trying to play it off, but it came out shaky. "Claws? Seriously? You've been watching too many horror movies. Go look for yourself," she said. I didn't want to. Every instinct I had told me to stay behind the counter and leave the guy alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a mop, a lame excuse to head back in his direction, and pretended to clean near his table. This time I saw them. His hands weren't normal. They were long, skeletal things, with fingers that seemed to bend at odd angles. His nails were black and sharp, almost like talons. I must have made a noise, because his head snapped toward me, those empty eyes locking onto mine. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. I froze, mop handle gripped tight in my sweaty palms. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Nothing," I stammered, taking a step back. "Just cleaning up." His mouth twitched, almost like he was trying to smile, but it came out wrong. Too wide, teeth too sharp. "Good," he said, dragging the word out longer than necessary. "Keep it that way." I bolted back to the counter, nearly tripping over the mop bucket. Lisa was already there, her face pale. "I told you," she hissed. "What the hell is wrong with that guy?" "I don't know," I whispered back, glancing over my shoulder. He was back to staring at the menu board, his claw-like hands resting on the table. They didn't move, not even a twitch. "Should we call someone?" Lisa asked. "The cops or something?" I shook my head. "And say what?" "Hey, there's a weird guy at McDonald's with creepy hands?" They'd laugh us off the phone. Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the guy stood up. It was so sudden and silent that it startled us both. He didn't grab his coffee, didn't throw away his trash, just rose to his full height, which was way taller than I expected, like at least 6.5 feet tall. He turned toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was hyper-aware we were watching him. And then, just as he reached the exit, he stopped. The automatic doors slid open, spilling in a gust of cold night air. But he didn't step outside. Instead, he turned his head, just enough to glance back at us over his shoulder. "I'll be seeing you," he said, his voice low and full of something I couldn't quite place. Malice? Amusement? Both? And then he walked out, disappearing into the darkness beyond the parking lot. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The restaurant was dead silent except for the hum of the fryers and the faint sound of the drive-through headset crackling. Then Lisa broke the silence. "What the hell does that mean?" "I'll be seeing you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Like, is he coming back? Is he following us home? "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach twisting into knots. "Maybe it's just something people say." "Yeah, people," Lisa muttered. "But I'm not so sure that guy was, people." I wanted to laugh, tell her she was being ridiculous. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling she might be right. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. Every time the door chimed or the drive-through headset beeped, I half expected to see him again, those dark, empty eyes staring back at me. But he never came back. By the time our shift ended at 5 a.m., the tension had worn us both thin. "You want a ride home?" I offered as we clocked out. Lisa lived a few blocks from me, and the thought of her walking alone didn't sit right after what we'd just experienced. "Nah," she said, forcing a weak smile. "I'll call my brother to pick me up. Thanks, though." We parted ways in the parking lot, and I got into my beat-up Toyota, the seat creaking as I sank into it. The drive home felt off. The streets were too empty, the streetlights casting weird shadows that made me paranoid. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing at the corner of a gas station, watching me as I drove past, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, they were gone. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my nerves were shot. I locked the car, double-checked the front door, and even wedged a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Then I flopped onto the couch, exhausted but too wired to sleep. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the window. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had to be, right? Just a branch brushing against the glass or something. But the sound was too deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone knocking, slow and patient. I stared at the window, my body frozen. The curtains were drawn, but the thought of pulling them back made my stomach churn. What if he was out there? What if it was out there? "Pull yourself together," I whispered to myself. "It's nothing. Just look." With every ounce of courage I could muster, I crept toward the window, my socks silent against the floor. The tapping stopped as I got closer, which somehow made it worse. My fingers trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain. One deep breath, then I yanked it back. Nothing, just my empty yard, illuminated by the pale glow of the street lamp. The tree branches swayed in the breeze, their shadows dancing across the lawn. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling equal parts stupid and relieved. But just as I was about to let the curtain fall, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the yard, just outside the pool of light from the street lamp. Tall, motionless, a shadow among shadows. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back from the window, the curtain slipping from my hand. I wanted to tell myself it wasn't him, that it was just my imagination or a trick of the light. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. The knocking started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the front door. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. The chair I'd wedged under the doorknob suddenly didn't feel like enough. The knocking was slow at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. Boom, boom, boom. Who is it? I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. Just more knocking, each thud rattling the door on its hinges. I glanced around the room, searching for something to defend myself with, and my eyes landed on the baseball bat propped up in the corner. I grabbed it, holding it like a lifeline. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. I stood there, bat in hand, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, something. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. "I'll be seeing you," the voice said, low and gravelly. The same words he'd spoken back at McDonald's. I stumbled back, clutching the bat so hard my knuckles turned white. The doorknob rattled, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Go away," I shouted. "I'm calling the cops." Nothing, just silence. And then, the sound of footsteps retreating down the porch steps. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, waiting to hear a car start or a door slam, but there was nothing. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the peephole, the porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted but grateful to see daylight again. Lisa called me around noon to check in. "Hey," she said. "You okay? You sound off." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired." She hesitated. "So, I wasn't going to bring this up, but did anything weird happen when you got home?" My stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because when my brother came to pick me up last night, he saw someone standing in the McDonald's parking lot. Tall guy, hoodie. He said the guy was just staring at the building." My blood ran cold. And then he was gone. Like, my brother looked away for a second, and when he looked back, the guy wasn't there anymore. I didn't know what to say. The words caught in my throat, choking on the fear that was quickly bubbling up again. "Be careful, okay?" Lisa said, her voice softer now. "If you see him again, just call me. Or the cops. Don't deal with it alone." "Yeah," I murmured. "You too." That night, I didn't go to work. Couldn't. I texted my manager and told him I was sick, then spent the evening triple-checking every lock in the house. But no matter how many precautions I took, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At 2:37 a.m., the exact time he'd left McDonald's the night before, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I told you, I'll be seeing you." The text on my phone blurred as my vision tunneled, panic wrapping its icy fingers around my throat. I sat there on the couch, my phone shaking in my hand. My first thought was to call the cops, but what was I going to say? "Hi, there's this guy who's been texting me creepy things and staring at McDonald's too long?" They'd laugh me off the line. I stared at the text again, half hoping I'd imagined it. But no, it was there clear as day. "I told you, I'll be seeing you." My phone buzzed again. Another text. "Why don't you open the door, Ryan?" I dropped the phone like it was a live wire. My heart stopped. He knew my name. How the hell did he know my name? Slowly, I looked toward the door. It was silent. No knocking, no footsteps, no sign of him. But somehow, I knew he was out there, standing on the other side, waiting. And then my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a picture. When I opened it, my blood turned to ice. It was me, sitting on the couch holding my phone. The angle was slightly tilted, like it was taken from just outside the living room window. I whipped my head toward the window, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were still drawn. I hadn't opened them since last night. But now, as I stared, I realized something. The edge of one curtain had shifted, just enough to leave a tiny gap. Enough for someone to peek through. I grabbed the bat again, my grip so tight I thought I'd snap it in two. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The only answer was silence. I don't remember how long I stood there, bat in hand, staring at that damn window. Felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. When nothing happened, I forced myself to move. I walked over to the window, yanked the curtain shut, and locked it. Then I did the same with every other window in the house. If he was watching me, I wasn't gonna give him the satisfaction anymore. But the texts kept coming. Smart move. Locks won't help you, though. You know what comes next, don't you? Each one sent a fresh wave of terror through me, but I refused to respond. I couldn't let him know how badly he was getting to me. Instead, I called Lisa. She picked up on the first ring. Ryan, what's going on? Lisa, he's texting me. I said, my voice trembling. He knows my name. He knows where I live. He's outside my house. What? She practically screamed. Did you call the cops? No, I admitted. What am I supposed to tell them? They won't believe me. Ryan, you're not staying there. Pack a bag and come to my place. Now. I hesitated. Leaving felt like giving up, like letting him win. But then my phone buzzed again, and I didn't need to look at it to know it was him. I grabbed my keys and ran for the door. The drive to Lisa's place was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every car that passed me made me jump. Every shadow on the sidewalk looked like it was about to step into the street. By the time I got to her apartment, I was shaking so badly I could barely get my key out of the ignition. Lisa met me at the door, her face pale but determined. You're staying here tonight, she said firmly, pulling me inside. Whatever this guy wants, he's not getting it. We sat in her living room, the TV on low to fill the silence. I didn't tell her about the texts or the picture. It didn't feel real enough to say out loud. Instead, I kept checking my phone, half expecting another message to pop up, but nothing came. Not until 2:37 a.m. The buzz startled both of us, and Lisa leaned over to see the screen as I unlocked my phone. This time, the message wasn't text. It was a video. I hesitated before pressing play, my stomach twisting into knots. Lisa gave me a worried look. Do you want me to? No, I said quickly. I need to see it. The video started with shaky footage of my house. The camera panned slowly across the yard, stopping at the window where I'd seen the gap in the curtain. Then it zoomed in, the lens focusing on the faint outline of me, standing in the living room with the bat in my hand. The timestamp was from 10 minutes ago. Oh my God, Lisa whispered, covering her mouth. The video cut to black, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then the screen flickered back to life, showing something else. This time, the camera was in motion, moving down a dark hallway. My hallway. It stopped in front of a door, my bedroom door. Slowly, the handle began to turn. The video ended there, leaving us both in stunned silence. He was inside your house, Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan, he was inside your house. Lisa's words hit me like a brick. He was inside my house. While I was there, while I was scrambling to lock the windows, while I was grabbing a bat and pacing my living room, he was already inside, watching, filming. I felt sick, like my stomach was trying to claw its way out of my body. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped my phone. Lisa grabbed my shoulder, her grip firm. We need to call the cops. Now. This time I didn't argue. Lisa dialed while I sat frozen, replaying the video in my mind. The slow turn of the doorknob, the dark hallway, it was burned into my brain, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers, a man and a woman, both looking like they'd seen it all before. They took our statements, listened to the story with furrowed brows and skeptical glances, and asked to see the video. I handed them my phone, half expecting the video to be gone, deleted, but it was still there, and as they watched it, their expressions shifted from mild annoyance to something much more serious. The male officer, whose name tag read Henderson, handed my phone back with a grim nod. This is concerning, he admitted. We'll send a patrol car to your house to check it out. In the meantime, I'd suggest staying here for the night. Don't go back home until we've had a chance to investigate. I nodded, grateful for the excuse not to go back. But as the officers left, I couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't fully understand. They were treating this like a stalker case, some weirdo with too much time on his hands. They didn't see his eyes. They didn't hear his voice, the way it slithered through the air like something alive. This wasn't just some guy. This was something else. Lisa insisted I sleep in her room, locking the door behind us and propping a chair under the handle for good measure. She fell asleep quickly, her exhaustion finally catching up to her, but I couldn't close my eyes. Every time I tried, I saw him, standing in the shadows, staring at me with those hollow, empty eyes. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, it was still dark, but something was off. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 2:37 a.m., and then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, coming from the bedroom window. My heart leapt into my throat. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay in bed, to pull the blanket over my head like a scared kid and pretend it wasn't happening. But I couldn't. I had to know. Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to wake Lisa. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, as I crept toward the window. My hands shook as I reached for the curtain, and for a moment, I hesitated. What if he was out there? What if this time he didn't leave? I yanked the curtain back. The window was empty. No figure, no face pressed against the glass. Nothing but the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I let out a shaky breath, my relief short-lived as I noticed something else. On the glass, written in what looked like condensation, were 3 words, "I see you." My blood ran cold. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling to the floor with a thud. The noise woke Lisa, who sat up groggily, her hair a mess. "What's going on?" she mumbled. I pointed to the window, unable to speak. She got up, rubbing her eyes, and when she saw the words, she froze. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're not safe here." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But Lisa grabbed it, her eyes scanning the screen before she turned it toward me. It was another video. The footage was shaky, the camera moving through a dark hallway. It took me a second to realize it wasn't just any hallway. It was Lisa's hallway. The camera stopped outside her bedroom door, and the screen went black. And then, in the silence of the room, we heard it. The faint creak of footsteps coming down the hall, the sound of those footsteps. It wasn't loud, but each creak of the floorboards hit like a gunshot in the silence. Lisa and I locked eyes, our panic reflected in each other's faces. She mouthed, "What do we do?" But I couldn't answer. My brain was frozen, running in frantic loops but finding no exit. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Lisa clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaky but loud enough to carry. No response. I grabbed the bat I had brought from my house and positioned myself in front of the door. Every muscle in my body coiled tight. I could feel Lisa moving behind me, fumbling for her phone. "I'm calling the cops," she whispered, her voice breaking. Before she could finish dialing, the doorknob turned. The chair we'd wedged under the handle held, but the door rattled violently against it, each jolt sending a fresh wave of terror through me. Whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't knocking or asking to come in. They were trying to force their way in. "Get out of here," I shouted, raising the bat. "I'll call the cops. They're on their way." The rattling stopped. For a second, everything was silent again, and I thought maybe it was over. Then, from the other side of the door, came a sound that made my blood turn to ice. It was laughter, low, guttural, and completely inhuman. It wasn't like someone laughing because they were amused. It was like the sound of something that enjoyed fear, something feeding off of it. Lisa's phone slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. "Ryan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not human." The laughter stopped, and then came a new sound. Scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the door, as if claws or something worse were dragging along the wood. I took a step back, tightening my grip on the bat. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Lisa. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "The window," she said. "We can climb out." I hesitated, glancing back at the door. The scratching had stopped, but I could feel its presence on the other side, waiting. It was like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on us. Go, I whispered to Lisa. I'll hold them off. No, she hissed. I'm not leaving without you. The scratching started again, louder this time. The thing on the other side must have heard us. Lisa, just go, I said, shoving her toward the window. She didn't argue this time. She threw open the window and climbed onto the fire escape, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I followed, just as the door splintered with a deafening crack. I didn't look back. Couldn't. We scrambled down the fire escape, the metal creaking beneath our weight. When we hit the ground, I grabbed Lisa's hand and ran, not knowing where we were going, just needing to get away. Behind us, the laughter started again, echoing through the empty streets. We didn't stop running until we reached a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away. The place was brightly lit, with a handful of bleary-eyed patrons nursing cups of coffee and plates of eggs. It felt surreal, stepping into the warmth and light after what had just happened, like we'd crossed into another world. The waitress behind the counter looked up as we stumbled in, her brow furrowing. You two okay? She asked. No, Lisa said, collapsing into a booth. Something broke into my apartment. The waitress frowned. Do you want me to call the police? Lisa nodded, too exhausted to speak. I sank into the seat across from her, still clutching the bat. My hands were trembling, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. The laughter, the scratching, the feeling that whatever was after us wasn't done. The police arrived 20 minutes later, a different pair of officers from the ones who had visited my house. We explained everything, or at least as much as we could without sounding completely insane. The officers exchanged skeptical glances but promised to check out Lisa's apartment. When they returned, their faces were pale. There's no sign of forced entry, one of them said, avoiding our eyes. But there's something you should see. Lisa and I exchanged a terrified glance as the officer spoke. What do you mean, something we should see? Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer hesitated, as if he wasn't sure how to explain. Finally, he said, We found writing on the walls. Everywhere. Writing, I echoed. What kind of writing? Instead of answering, the officer pulled out his phone and held it up, showing us a photo. My stomach lurched as I recognized the inside of Lisa's bedroom. The walls were covered in long, jagged scratches, as if something with claws had carved into them. Over and over, the same 3 words were gouged into the paint and plaster. I see you. Lisa clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob, her eyes wide with horror. That's impossible, she whispered. We got out. It couldn't have been there that long. It wasn't, the officer said grimly. Whoever or whatever did this, they didn't stop when you left. The cops escorted us back to Lisa's apartment the next morning. Daylight made everything feel less sinister, but as soon as we stepped inside, that sense of security evaporated. The air was heavy, suffocating, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The scratches were real, deep gouges that crisscrossed every inch of her bedroom walls. The words weren't just written, they were embedded, dug into the structure of the building like scars that would never heal. Even worse, there was a faint, metallic smell in the room, like rust or blood. But the worst part, on Lisa's mirror, written in the same jagged scratches, was my name. Ryan. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. Why my name? Why? I couldn't finish the question. The implications were too terrifying to process. The officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. We need to get you both out of here. Now. No, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. I'm not running anymore. I want to know what this thing wants. Lisa grabbed my arm, shaking her head furiously. Are you insane? It doesn't want anything, Ryan. It's playing with us. It's a predator, and we're the prey. But I couldn't let it go. Not after it had followed us from the McDonald's. Not after it had invaded both our homes. I turned to the officer. You said there were no signs of forced entry, right? How did it get in? The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. There's no logical explanation, he admitted. The locks weren't tampered with. No broken windows. It's like, it just appeared. We left Lisa's apartment that afternoon, neither of us willing to stay there another second. The cops promised to investigate further, but their words felt hollow. What could they do against something like this? Something that wasn't bound by the same rules as us? Lisa crashed at a friend's place, and I decided to stay with my cousin on the other side of town. I figured if I kept moving, it wouldn't be able to follow me. But that night, at exactly 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a photo. This time, it showed me standing in my cousin's kitchen, holding a glass of water. The timestamp was from less than a minute ago. I dropped the phone and turned toward the window, my heart pounding. The blinds were open just a crack, and through the gap, I saw it. A figure standing in the yard, its face hidden by a hood, its eyes darker than the night surrounding it. But this time it didn't stay still. It lifted a long, skeletal hand and pointed directly at me. I ran out of the kitchen, down the hall, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I barricaded it with a chair and pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't dare look at it. The laughter started then, muffled at first, like it was coming from far away, but it got louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from inside the room. I clutched the bat, my knuckles white, and whispered, "What do you want?" The laughter stopped, and then, in a voice that was low and gravelly and impossibly familiar, it whispered back, "I told you, I'll be seeing you." That was the last time I ever heard from Lisa. The last time I stayed in one place for longer than a night. I'm always moving now, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next text, the next knock, the next laugh. Because no matter where I go, I know one thing for sure. It's still watching. And one day it'll find me again.